There we go. Yeah, there it is. All right. Good morning. Welcome to Centennial. My name is David. I'm the pastor here. Happy New Year. Special welcome to those of you who are visiting for the first time. I'm excited to see you made the resolution to come back to church for the entirety of 2023. So we look forward to seeing you in the 52 coming weeks as well. 51? I don't know. I'm not a math person, but anyway, if you're interested in getting plugged into life in our church, there is a connection card that you can fill out in the lobby, and I will personally email you to respond to it. So if you're interested in getting plugged in, be sure to do that before you head out the door. So our Old Testament passage this morning, as Greg mentioned, comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. So let me read that section for us. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows down to the south and goes around to the north. Around and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, "See, this is new"? It has been there already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. Let me pray for our time together. Father, thank you for another year to worship you, to know you, to love you, and to be loved by you through Christ. Father, we pray that this time in Ecclesiastes, both today and in the future, would be edifying, uplifting, and helpful to our souls. May it help us to trust you deeper, to understand our suffering in our lives better, and to react to them in a more godly manner. Father, give us your Spirit this morning, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I hope you guys are feeling better. I know it's not true of all of you, but I felt like everybody that I was interacting with around Christmas, a week ago, Christmas Eve, you all were getting sick. And there is nothing worse than being sick on Christmas, on the holidays. I remember many years ago when I was in the 8th grade, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was food poisoning or the flu, but I woke up at like 4 a.m. Christmas morning with stomach pain and I threw up. And it was just the absolute worst. And then I threw up again and again and again. And of course, you're sitting there watching your brothers and your parents open their stockings and their gifts and everything. And there I am just moaning, motionless on the ground, trying to ride out the nausea and the pain that I was experiencing. And vomiting, there's something just particularly awful about throwing up. And if you've never thought about it before, I'm going to force you to think about it right now. It's one of those things that causes sensory overload in the worst way possible. So think about your 5 senses. You have to taste the throw up. You have to smell the throw up. You actually have to hear yourself doing it. If you don't close your eyes, you see yourself doing it. And then depending on where it happened, you might have to touch it and then clean it up. All right, it is awful. It is disgusting. And in my opinion, though, that doesn't even think or consider the worst part about it, which is dealing with whatever it is you threw up in the future. Now, when it happened to me over Christmas, we had eaten prime rib, and prime rib is not something that I eat commonly, so it wasn't a huge deal to eat it again. But many people, when they get sick, they get food poisoning, whatever, they're like, I'm going to actively avoid it. All right, I had bad sushi, bad pizza, bad fish. I'm never eating it again. But I remember one time when I was 5 and I got food poisoning, it was from McDonald's. And like, you can't just avoid McDonald's. I'm an American citizen. I'm going to go on a road trip again and have nothing else to eat. So I had to figure out how in the world I was going to eat McDonald's again. So despite the fact that I associated it with getting me sick, I eventually had to go back to McDonald's and see the sights and smell the smells and taste the taste, and it was awful for the first 2 or 3 weeks, or 2 to 3 trips, I should say. I didn't eat there 3 weeks in a row, but that only happened once. But after I ate there a couple of times, maybe about the 4th or the 5th time, I was finally able to re-enjoy this food, this delicacy that I had come to know and love. And I no longer thought about that time I got sick. I don't know how you personally reacted to hearing that we were going to be back in Ecclesiastes. A lot of you, since I've come here 7 months ago, have expressed great interest in returning to this great wisdom book of the Bible. But for some of you here this morning, this might feel like a return trip to McDonald's. Because the last time that our church went through this book, we got sick. And it can be really hard, and it can bring up some painful, foul-tasting memories to be back here. But part of the reason I want to go back through this book with all of you is for healing, for exposure therapy in some sense. But my main purpose in stopping here this morning and diving into Ecclesiastes with you is because, well, we went through the ringer in the last 4 years, both as Centennial Church, as Christians, as Americans, as human beings. Let me just give you some highlights, or should I say lowlights, of the things that we've experienced in the last 4 years. Let's start at the top. Massive wildfires in Australia and the ongoing existential problem of how to properly care for our planet. Harvey Weinstein, one of Hollywood's most famous film producers who produced, I assume we all love this trilogy, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, was finally sentenced to prison for serial sexual abuse and the ongoing problem of abusive leaders. The United States, you might remember this, in January of 2020, we assassinated an Iranian general, and we all thought World War III was going to start. And we've had other headlines that have caused us to wonder if a third world war is beginning. Of course, we've had COVID. We've had masks. We've had mass debates. We've had vaccines. We've had vaccine debates. We had the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent conviction of Derek Chauvin. Of course, in the last 4 years, we had the Trump-Biden election, and you might remember the midterms just 4 months ago or 3 months ago. The United States pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, and more recently, we've had this ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Not a lot of highlights in our world. And by the way, none of this includes any of the personal struggles that you might have faced in the last 4 years either. You might have moved. You or someone in your family might have gotten sick with something chronic and serious. You might have had issues with children, either raising them or conceiving them. You might have had job loss. You likely lost friends in the last 4 years. I mean, life for the last 4 years has really stunk. And when you go through so much, you need space to try and sort through what in the world just happened. And you need that space, not just mentally and emotionally, but you need that space spiritually. You need space to ask questions like, why did God allow this church to go through so much suffering in the last 4 years? This world, so much perplexity and pain. Was there a reason behind it? Moreover, if God knew there was going to be so much suffering in the world, why did he create us to begin with? Do we exist just for pain? And all of that leads to our sermon series for the next 5 or 6 months, which is Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes, if you're unfamiliar with the book, is found in the wisdom section of our Bibles, amidst the Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and Song of Songs. And the wisdom that Ecclesiastes provides is nothing more and nothing less than an honest look and expectation for what we should be ready to experience in this life. Why does suffering happen? What is our purpose here in this world? And what should I expect when I wake up in the morning and venture out into the world? Now, you probably saw the title of my sermon today, which is the tagline for our sermon series, which is Life Stinks and Then You Die. Not exactly the happiest of things, but the life that Ecclesiastes says we can expect here on this earth is mostly terrible, a lot of times unreasonable, and not very understandable. But as much as we might want to shy away from reading a book like that, as depressing as it sounds, there's also something uniquely encouraging about being warned about that sort of life, being given that sort of expectation. Maybe you remember this children's book, Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. Do you ever read that, or did you read that to your kids? It was one of my favorites, and this is the kid version of Ecclesiastes, in my opinion. This is how it opens. I went to sleep with gum in my mouth, and now there's gum in my hair, and when I got out of bed this morning, I tripped on the skateboard, and by mistake, I dropped my sweater in the sink while the water was running, and I could tell that it was going to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. I think I'll move to Australia. And the book just goes on like that. Alex gets the middle seat in the carpool, so he can't see out the window. He gets no dessert in his lunchbox. His mom forgot. There was no decoder ring in his cereal, but his brothers all got one. He found or at least the dentist found a cavity in his mouth, and everybody else was just clean, spick and span. And you're like, well, at least the book might end on a high note. I mean, this is a children's book after all. But here's how the book ends. When I went to bed, this is still Alex speaking, Nick, his brother, took back the pillow he said I could keep, and the Mickey Mouse nightlight burned out, and I bit my tongue. The cat wants to sleep with Anthony and not with me. It has been a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. My mom says some days are like that, even in Australia. And that's the ending. There's no justice for Alex, no redemption, and this is a children's book. There's supposed to be this overall theme and like this grand message we're supposed to take away. And the message, I have to assume, is just to warn kids and maybe the parents reading the story that life stinks. That life, some days, yeah, they're better than others, but most of the time we will not get the lives that we really want. But whether it's a child hearing a bedtime story or an adult hearing in a Sunday service, hearing the message that life stinks can be and is an encouragement for us because it teaches us to enjoy those little good things that we experience. It causes us to pursue what's ultimately best for us, and it removes our temptation to self-pity and cynicism and maybe even the anger we might feel at the world because we're ready for what we're about to face. So that's my goal for going through Ecclesiastes with you, is that we might be a people who more deeply trust God as a result, a people who better understand what we can expect in this life and how we can handle the suffering and pain that we will eventually experience. Now, that's the 10,000-foot view of Ecclesiastes. And you might remember when I introduced Malachi, we went through some of those nitty-gritty details of the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. And we're going to do that again with Ecclesiastes. But true to the theme of Ecclesiastes, as soon as I started reading commentators to find answers to these things, everything got more complicated. As we read in Ecclesiastes 12:12, much study is a weariness of the flesh. So don't go back to school, just stop studying, it'll just hurt you. Now, here's why I say that. We read in verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So I read that and I think, sweet, the who, the when, and the where are all taken care of right there. Solomon wrote this while he was reigning as king in Jerusalem. That was probably around the 900s BC, right? Wrong, because that is not how life works and it's not that easy. And really, it is that who question that gets difficult to answer. Who wrote Ecclesiastes? And admittedly, the best way that I can explain this to you, because this is the way that I explain this to myself, is that Ecclesiastes, the author and the structure, are sort of like the movie The Princess Bride. All right, do you remember seeing that movie? I had never seen it until like 3 or 4 years ago, and I remember I watched it, I put it in the DVD player or wherever it was I watched it, and I was expecting from the jump of the movie horses and kings and princes and knights and sword fights. And you might remember that movie opens with this grandpa in the 20th century visiting his Chicago Bears fan grandson. He's homesick from school, and I'm like, what is going on here? And the same thing is kind of happening in Ecclesiastes. You might notice, if you have a Bible in front of you, that the first verses here, and especially the last chapter in chapter 12, are in this reflective third-person writing, almost like someone is sitting down to tell this story to someone else. In verse 1, we read, "the preacher," and then in verse 12 of chapter 1, everything shifts to the first person. So, most commentators conclude that there was an author, or a grandpa figure, if that's better for you, who compiled everything together and then possibly read these things to either a hypothetical or real son of his. Now, the what the author compiles and reads is the words of a second person, known as the preacher, which again, admittedly, is not a great translation. The actual Hebrew word here is the word kohelet. I know you're all erudite scholars, so I know you all know what that means. If you forgot what that means, it literally means one who gathers, one who brings in, which is kind of an odd moniker. A better visual, one we often get, is a teacher or professor. If you're familiar with the work of the Bible Project, the way they describe this person as the critic, like a film critic or a movie critic. And like I said, many commentators conclude that this teacher or critic was not actually Solomon, but rather someone posing as Solomon almost, and writing as if he were Solomon. Now you might say, why would somebody do that? And commentator Tremper Longman wrote a great detailed argument about this, but I'll highlight his paragraph here. And there's that word. Kohelet is not Solomon, but he does adopt a Solomonic persona to explore the avenues of meaning in the world. It is only in the first 3 chapters of the book that we even get a hint of association with the great king of Israel. This section describes Kohelet's search for meaning, and he tries to find meaning in a number of different areas, including wisdom, wealth, women, and building projects. Who knew and experienced the height of these areas more than Solomon? He continues, Solomon was the richest and wisest king that Israel ever knew. He also constructed more buildings, most notably the temple, and married more women than anybody. Nonetheless, the historical books inform us that though Solomon reached the pinnacle in life, he ended his life as an apostate. The person who calls himself Kohelet pretends to be Solomon in order to argue that if Solomon cannot find satisfaction and meaning in these areas of life, that no one can. So, what does all this mean? It means the who of Ecclesiastes likely wasn't Solomon. It also means that Ecclesiastes was written probably in the post-exile and probably had an audience similar to Malachi's. You might remember Malachi's audience was a group of people who just went through a ton of suffering, and they're wondering how to approach God and the life around them. So that's the who, the when, the where, and the why. But in verse 2, we see the what. We see the thesis statement and the main source of content for this book, which is vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. I used to think, I don't know about you, I used to think vanity just meant looking at yourself in the mirror for too long. So I didn't actually understand what was happening here. But the word vanity in English really just means meaningless. But something deeper is happening here in the Hebrew. The word for vanity in Hebrew actually means smoke or vapor. So everything in life is vapor. It's visible and then quickly gone. It has shape before your eyes, but you can't hold on to it or keep it. And that's what life is. Everything is fleeting and nothing is ultimately certain, except for death, taxes, and pain. How's that for good news to start your year? What do we do with that, David? Well, with the remaining time this morning, I want to look at the rest of these verses with you and ponder 3 questions that I think will set up the rest of this book well for us. Number 1, why does life stink? 2, how or in what way does life stink? And then thirdly, what might make life not stink? All right, so that's where we're going this morning. Let's think about that first question. Verse 3, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Now, verse 3 probably doesn't look like the answer to the question, why does life stink? And it's really not, but it points us to the answer. If you're familiar with your Bibles, God in Genesis created the heavens and the earth, everything seen and unseen. And God made man, and he made woman. And God made one lone charge to that man and woman that he had made. God said to them, "Go and enjoy everything that I have made for you. But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it you shall surely die." And if you're familiar with the Genesis story, you know what happens next. After enjoying God's good creation with intimate fellowship with God, the man and the woman are deceived by the serpent, break God's lone commandment, and lose the perfect world that we were meant to dwell in. So God comes down now, and he has every right to toss them aside like scrap paper and obliterate the world that he created. You're not going to be obedient to me? Fine, I'll start over. But that's not how God approaches them. Instead, in amazing grace, he does not immediately kill the man or the woman. Instead, God gives curses, with the worst curse being brought upon the serpent who deceived them. But God eventually does turn to the man and woman, his image bearers, and say, as punishment for your sin, you will experience physical death, decay, and imperfection around you for all of your lives. The wonder of childbearing will be hurt. It'll be cursed with pain. Your marriage will become difficult and your desires will not line up with each other. That's why fighting happens in your marriages and in your relationships, because of the fall. And then God says, and here's our connection with Ecclesiastes, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat on your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So basically, the critic, Kohelet, the teacher, the preacher, opens Ecclesiastes by reminding us that work is going to stink. That is the curse that we have been given. It's going to be hot, sweaty, and oftentimes not very fruitful. We read, "What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun?" And work feels meaningless to us because we, mankind, chose stuff over God. So why is everything the way that it is? Very simply because of sin. Or if you want a more specific, more robust answer, everything stinks around us because of human beings. But what does it actually mean that everything stinks? And the teacher will expand on this idea as we continue throughout Ecclesiastes. But this morning, he focuses on this idea of the painful monotony that we see all around us. We read in verse 4, "A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing." As I was reading through this passage, I don't know about you, but I thought about SpongeBob SquarePants. Listen, if you want quotes from Socrates or Plato, all right, there are plenty of other solid churches in this area. This is who you hired, okay? There is a connection between SpongeBob SquarePants and the Bible. And if you've never seen the show, first of all, you're missing out. I think they're all on Amazon Prime, but I can't remember. But the thing you should know about the show is that SpongeBob, yes, he's the main character, but he's not alone on the show. He has two neighbors. He has Patrick Star, the starfish, and then he has a neighbor, Squidward, who's obviously a squid. Now, Patrick and SpongeBob are two peas in a pod. They're silly, they're rambunctious, but Squidward, the neighbor who lives between them, is this classy, suave, sophisticated, cultured individual. And one day, Squidward decides, "I've had enough of your shenanigans, and I'm going to move away to a place called Tentacle Acres." Maybe some of you remember this episode. And this place has got everything that Squidward likes. It's got good food, there's biking, there's dancing, there's clarinet recitals, and he thinks life is just swell. I mean, this is heaven in Bikini Bottom. But then this montage occurs as Squidward experiences all of these things, over and over and over and over and over again. And the big smile that he started with suddenly turns into a frown. Because yes, he was experiencing good things, but life's monotony of it all became depressing and boring to him. So life, we know this from SpongeBob, is painfully monotonous. And the teacher in Ecclesiastes points to nature itself as proof of that. A generation comes, a generation goes. The wind blows east, then it blows west. Oh, it's blowing north again. Nope, now it's back to the east. The streams of a river might be soothing to our ears, but inevitably they just flow to where they're going to go, and then they flow back to where they started. That's all we can expect in life. Everything is the same. Nothing is inherently interesting or noteworthy. And I love the summary of it all in verse 8. We already read this, but I'll read it again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. I thought about the fact that my wife always wants her and I to travel more, to go out and see the world. And I'm like, listen, I don't need to travel. I have Google image search. If I fly 12 hours to see something that I could have just seen on Google, I'm going to be upset about it because my eyes aren't actually going to be interested by it. I'm like Ron Swanson on his trip to England, standing in front of Big Ben going, look, a clock. We don't have one of those in America. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, and a man cannot utter it. It's almost like everybody knows something is fleeting and unsatisfactory about this life, and we can't explain it. And there's got to be something more to this, right? And right now, there's a generation of Zoomers starting to wrestle through those questions. They're in their early 20s asking things like, is this it? Do I just work, maybe get a family, and then die? And to be honest, as we look at Ecclesiastes, yeah, pretty much. You got to sleep, you got to eat, you got to work for food and shelter, so that's it. And a lot of people recognize the monotony of this life, and so in order to flee it, what do? They try to find something new. That's what we read about in verse 9. What has been done is what will be, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been done before the ages. And yet we look for the new in a variety of different things. Some people change their hairstyles. They get haircuts. They change their wardrobes. They change their jobs. They change their cars. They change houses. They change where they live. They change their phones. I was so excited a year ago when I got an iPhone 13 because I'm like, I have never gotten a brand new iPhone. This is so exciting. I just went from a 7 to a 13. This is great. And then 6 months later, the 14 comes out. And I just felt this raw urge to go and buy it because I'm like, it's new. It's going to make my life infinitely better. I'm going to shell out $1,000 for basically the same phone. But that's what we do because we want something new. I mentioned the midterms earlier, and essentially those elections are basically one giant plea from the country that we want something new and different. Typically in a blue presidency, like we saw in Obama's in 2014, there was a red wave in the midterms. In 2018, during Trump's presidency, there was a blue wave. We just want something new. And of course, the most tragic example we can think of in our lives of wanting newness is when mom and dad want a new lover and a new life, and so they cheat. And I know we joke about trading in for a younger model, but Ecclesiastes 1:10 is why that's even a temptation to begin with. We want something new. So we're cursed because of sin. This curse leads to a life of monotony, and therefore we search and pry and beg for newness. So, third question, is there anything we can do to make life not stink? Let's look at verse 11. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. Again, that's not really an answer, but it leads us to the answer. A few years ago, the greatest post-game interview in sports history was conducted. Andrew Whitworth was an aging offensive lineman who played for the Los Angeles Rams football team, and they had just lost the Super Bowl to the New England Patriots. Might have been Whitworth's last chance at a championship. After the game, reporters filed into the locker room and asked Whitworth for a comment, and this is what he said. "You're not going to get me to pout and feel sorry for myself. I realize what this game means. I cherish it. I don't care if I have a Hall of Fame bust or if you've been a Pro Bowler or win 20 Super Bowls. Listen to this. At the end of the day, you're all going to die." That's how I feel about the Vikings most Sundays. But Whitworth captures it, right? Like, that's the fleetingness. Like, we're going to die. And our victories, whether big or small in this life, suddenly look very meaningless in the face of that death. They seem like smoke, vapor. Now, it's interesting. Whitworth goes on to say in this interview, like many people do, that, well, okay, so the purpose of life then is about character. It's about holding your head up high and being a good person. And verse 11 here is like, nope, because you're going to be dead, and in 200 years, no one will remember you nor care about your morality. So where do we go with all that? I do believe there is an option for us. And the option for us this morning is to embrace the vanity of life. Embrace the idea that our lives are vapor and smoke and fleeting and meaningless at times. But you might say, how is that supposed to make me feel better? And it makes us feel better because we stop trying to find purpose, identity, pleasure, and joy in the things that are around us. They're vapor, they're smoke. So I don't look to my wife or my future kids for my purpose, for being alive. I don't look to this job as my source of identity, strength, and satisfaction. And I definitely don't look to the Vikings for joy. I mean, all bets are off in 4 hours or whenever they begin, but I'm praying, man. But you know, like you get to your job, right, and you have a bad day at work, and your boss comes in, and I don't know if you get this via email, text, phone call, whatever. Your boss comes in and says, you messed up, you made a mistake, you erred, you're in big trouble. How do you respond to that? I know my two temptations are either to say, work is my complete identity, and this has wrecked me to my core. And I am going to stop at nothing until I am considered a good coworker again. And until that happens, I'm going to project all my frustration, all my anger on my family, my friends, my dog, my coworkers, because I just want to be known as good. Or you could say, well, work is dumb. I'm just going to go chug 10 beers at the bar with my buddies and not feel anything, because who cares? Those are the two common temptations. Pastor Tim Keller talks about these responses in a short book of his titled The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. And when I say short, that's not a pastor term for short. It is short. It's like 60 pages long. So this quote, you basically read 10% of this book. But he writes this: the world tells a person who is devastated by criticism to deal with it by saying, who cares what they think? I know what I think. Who cares what the rabble thinks? It doesn't bother me. People are devastated by criticism. Or they're not devastated by criticism because they do not listen to it. They will not listen to it or learn from it because they do not care about it. They know who they are and what they think. In other words, our only solution given by the world to low self-esteem is pride. But that's no solution. Both low self-esteem and pride are horrible nuisances to our own future and everyone around us. So what is the answer? What is the third option? Where is the hope? Well, the premise of Keller's book here is built around 1 Corinthians 4, verses 3 to 4. And it seems like an offhand comment from Paul, but there is a gold mine in here if we'll plumb for it. We read, but with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I don't even judge myself. For I'm not aware of anything against myself, but I'm not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. And here's what Paul is saying to the Corinthians. I don't let you judge me. I don't even let me judge me. It's God who judges me, and it's his judgment that I listen to. And that's what we're called to. And God's judgment of us in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is this: I am far more sinful than I ever dared thought I was, because Jesus had to go to the cross. But I am more loved, forgiven, and accepted in Jesus than I could ever hope, because Jesus went to the cross for me. Therefore, in that judgment, what I can bring into Ecclesiastes this morning is this: I don't let anybody around me define my purpose or meaning in life. I don't even try to supply the meaning myself. The meaning, purpose, identity, satisfaction, joy, pleasure of my life is centered on God, who he is, who he says I am in the gospel, and what he says about the world around me. Therefore, my wife, my kids, they're not my ultimate thing. My job is not my ultimate thing. Jesus says to do my job well. He says to love my wife. But these things are not ultimate. You see, the key to making life not stink is not to try and give life a meaning on your own, nor let someone else define it for you. The key to making life stink is and make life not stink, is to have God have total control of the world around you and of you personally. The meaning of life in the Garden of Eden that we talked about earlier, it was fellowship with God. You had God coming down in the cool of the day. God was ready to hang out with Adam and Eve, but we broke it. And now we experience all that Ecclesiastes says we do. But what Jesus Christ offers is restoration, deliverance, and hope back into that meaning. New fellowship with God, where the great identity of our existence is adoption into God's family as his beloved child. Not work, not marriage. My meaning is a love relationship with Christ. And if you've never had a relationship with God like that before, I invite you to come to Jesus this morning and trust him for that meaning. And if you're here this morning and you've got that relationship, I invite you to consider what things in your life might be trying to make themselves ultimate to you. The temptations to various things are so real. Where are you looking for life's meaning? And would you remember that it comes from the cross, from the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? Let's close our time by responding to that gospel news.